This teaching is titled The Left in the Philippines, A Century of Counterrevolution. Marx's thesis on Feuerbach states that, while hitherto philosophers have only interpreted the world, the point is to change it. The Philippine left was able to do so, but not according to plan. As a colony of the United States, the Philippines was positioned to extend the socialist movement into Asia. Instead, both the American and the Philippine left hypostatized self-determination, well past the ripeness for world revolution that Lenin hoped for, into the rottenness of post-colonial, then neoliberal independence. This teaching follows Philippine communism along a path of decline and regression between two key moments: the period of post-Bolshevik Marxism, which is from 1923 to 1940 in Platypus historiography, and the new left to communism's collapse from 1968 to 1989. Begins with the nationalism of the old left during the 1920s Third Period and the 1930s Popular Front, a regression with which the new left grappled and eventually succumbed. It concludes by showing how by the 1990s, not only the Philippines, but globally, the left's accumulated failures produced an antinomy between anti-imperialism and anti-fascism, leaving it crippled and in a post-political state. So the teaching will kind of follow this antinomy and thread it throughout the history of the 1920s to the present. So beginning with the old left, 1923 to 1940. The 20th century's counter-revolutionary arc can be traced to a year marked by the left's failure on a global scale, 1923. The Communist Party's German October was crushed, revolution in Germany. Lenin entered his final convalescence, and Stalin consolidated control. That same year, the American Workers' Party was founded after splitting from the Socialist Party. Meanwhile, the Philippines' own Workers' Party, called Partido Obrero, did nothing in the face of the Campaign for Independence, which demanded national unity. To explain each failure, it is necessary to consider global post-Bolshevik Marxism's regression. For Rosa Luxemburg, regression was antithetical to the notion of linear progress. When faced with a German civil war, she announced that origin is the goal. This meant that the revolution within democracy, confronted by Marx in 1848, had returned, only now with the working class led by a Marxist mass party. If Luxemburg's historical moment was dynamic, her murder and the subsequent failure of communism to make good on social democracy's crisis inaugurated a static expanse of history that Walter Benjamin analogized to a waiting room, not merely regressing while progressing, but actually and actively repressing its own history. Regression was a lacuna for both the old and the new left, whose dismissal of Second International thinkers like Karl Kautsky has impoverished Marxism. Kautsky and his cohort of Marxists had little influence over the Philippines, which was still a rural backwater when the social democratic movement emerged from the discontents and potentials of the late 19th century. The dynamism of this belle epoque, which Mark Twain sardonically called the Gilded Age, was also at crisis in liberalism, driven by workers demanding their right to labor. Technologically, the struggle led to the rationalization of production, replacing labor with machinery. Politically, the workers' movement swelled Marxian political parties worldwide, peaking in the German Social Democratic Party, or SPD. By 1900, the SPD's success generated a theoretical debate over the meaning of revolution called the revisionist dispute. Looking to England's trade union movement as an example, Edward Bernstein thought that capitalist interests could be subordinated to a political majority through the working class's struggle for socialism within liberal democracy. Luxemburg countered that socialism heightened capitalism's contradictions, while workers' mass organizations exacerbated rather than ameliorated democracy's crisis. Reform and revolution were tied up in a dialectic that at the outset of the First World War split the workers' movement into warring camps on a global scale. By 1917, Lenin's Bolsheviks saw the split as a precondition for revolution and were followed by Germany 1 year later. As the SPD underwent multiple fractures, Luxemburg raised the possibility that the emerging Communist Party would not be able to unlearn how to learn, that is, to master a transformed field of struggle. In the United States, the Socialist Party confronted the same moment, but with less political maturity, insufficient theoretical deliberation, and without the Bolsheviks' organizational cohesion. This was in part due to the fact that socialism had to intervene across the division of Republican big party capitalist liberalism versus Democrat Party middle-class conservatism. In the 1912 election, Teddy Roosevelt, running on the Progressive Party ticket, outmaneuvered and assimilated planks from Eugene Debs' platform, splitting the vote and handing the victory to the Democrat Woodrow Wilson. The latter argued freedom's meaning had changed, requiring a shift from the Founding Fathers' notion of checks and balances. His new freedom was ostensibly politically impartial and rational government administration in the service of progress. Essentially, it was pitched at the problem of political cronyism or vote buying that mass democracy was engendering. The slogan allowed him to cater to the liberal attitudes of trade unionists while supporting another important constituency, the anti-imperialist League, in its demands for liberating the Philippines from American aggression. Republican imperialism and Democrat progressivism were bound up in the Philippines, which, if not colonized, would have fractured into 3 weak, Cadillo-ridden states along Latin American lines. And that's Benedict Anderson's claim, not mine, but I would agree. By making anti-imperialism the basis of his 1900 campaign, William Jennings Bryan led the populists into the Democratic Party and inspired Emilio Aguinaldo to harass American troops in order to influence the American elections. The 1916 Jones Act, for whose passage Bryan, then the Secretary of State, congratulated the Anti-Imperialist League, was a means of extending the war between the Democrats and the Republicans abroad. It accelerated the Philippinization of the civil service, as well as the government's growing involvement in industry and banking. Another leader in the Anti-Imperialist League, Samuel Gompers, established affiliated and segregated unions in the Philippines with Governor Taft's benediction. According to Gompers, the Congreso Obrero de Filipinas, or COF, which was formed in 1913, naturally turned to the American Federation of Labor for help in drafting its constitution and program. Gompers, a self-trained utopian socialist, believed himself to be in service of a new civilization, which is the International Brotherhood of Man. It was in light of this ideal, as well as nominal protection for the AFL from antitrust injunctions, that he guaranteed labor peace during the war with Wilson's Council of National Defense, on which he sat. And just to put a fine point on that, basically, the antitrust legislation that was percolating up in this moment was actually originally also directed not only at trusts, but also at labor unions, like, of course, the AFL, or the American Federation of Labor. Just weeks after the 1917 revolution, Wilson echoed Gompers' sentiment in front of the AFL's National Convention, where he spoke. Against the socialist mob spirit, which he associated with the Bolsheviks, he argued for another democratic project. In his words, to release the spirits of the world from bondage. Yet bondage rather than peace was in store for thousands of socialists like Eugene Debs, who were thrown into prison after police raids carried out by Wilson's Department of Justice. While Wilson sought to subordinate big business to the authority of a progressive administration under the guise of restoring petty bourgeois autonomy, antitrust action, in other words, Debs considered the Democratic Party to represent the wail and cry of the perishing middle class. In this, he followed Lenin, who recognized the monopolies as a higher socioeconomic order, the potential and possibility for communism. Well, 1917 presented the world with peace on the basis of either Lenin or Wilson's vision. Without a doubt, it was the latter's call for national self-determination that put the question of independence squarely on the agenda. However, the progressive agenda was stymied by the Republican sweep of the 1920s election. Contrary to Wilson's claims that the end was almost in sight for the progressive goal of liberation, the Republican-backed Woods-Forbes mission found Philippinization had damaged the civil service and that the government's banking and commercial ventures in which it had invested resulted in responsibility without authority. Leonard Wood, head of the mission, companion of Roosevelt's and famous for both abolishing slavery in the country, which he did, and having authorized the Bud Didao massacre, an infamous massacre in Mindanao, became the governor and tapped the brakes on independence. Along with Wilson's collapsed government came a thaw in the Red Scare, creating space for two different communist parties of America to emerge from clandestine existence. They had basically been driven underground by Wilson's Department of Justice. The Comintern forced a merger, and an above-ground organization, the Workers' Party of America, was established. In 1924, they sent Alfred Wagenknecht to the Philippines to organize the Comintern's forthcoming labor conference at Canton. One Filipino delegate that he rounded up later admitted, "We were pro-Russian only to the extent that if America would not grant independence to the Philippines, Russia's help would be sought." And this is, in fact, the claim of Araneta, who did the first PhD dissertation on the old left, the Partido Comunista ng Pilipinas. His claim is that effectively what the Anti-Imperialist League was doing for the Philippines, the Comintern took over. In other words, its agenda vis-a-vis the Philippine left was progressive, and they were seen as partners by the Philippine left. Only the Soviets replaced the Americans, the American progressives. One Filipino delegate that he had rounded up later admitted, "We were pro-Russian only to the extent if America would not grant independence to the Philippines, Russia's help would be sought." The labor leaders were, according to Wagenknecht, the usual American Federation of Labor type, opposed to Bolshevism, engaged in scabbing against rival unions, and discriminatory against Chinese workers. Worse, they were wedded to the Nationalista Party, the dominant or leading party, the majority party, and campaigned for independence that was opportunistic, compromised, and steeped in a morass of bourgeois ideology. So Wagenknecht's words. Despite Wagenknecht's contempt, the communists attempted to instrumentalize nationalism. Dormant for 2 years, the Philippine Workers' Party was reactivated in 1924 with the eventual aid of forming both a Communist Party and a National Revolutionary Party. They wanted to basically help develop both. Historian Ken Fuller describes the revolutionary strategy as a coalition between communists and nationalists. After fighting for independence in the first stage, a second would be reached where the differences within the nationalist coalition sharpen, leading to the struggle to bring about the socialist stage of the revolution. This stage theory of revolution was confounded, however, not only by its base in craft unionism, but more importantly by party politics. The prevailing political balance was appended with the 1924 Fairfield Bill, in which the American Congress proposed the Philippines' transition to Commonwealth status, then full autonomy. But the ruling Nationalista Party was unprepared to actually inherit power. And in fact, they neglected to actively campaign with the progressive wing of the Democratic Party, who was calling for immediate and full liberation. So not even this Commonwealth status that the Fairfield Bill proposed, but something far more radical. Manuel Quezon, head of the colonial administration, struck a secret deal with Washington to delay independence, something discovered by the opposition Democratic Party's candidate, Claro Recto, and revealed to great public scandal. Ironically, the controversy played a crucial role in bringing the Workers' Party properly to life. Many nationalistas joined, infusing the party with contradictory agendas. Problems were compounded after the Chinese workers were radicalized by the 1927 Chinese Revolution and were nevertheless denied entry to the COF, the labor federation previously mentioned. In 1929, the Workers' Party made a bid for industrial restructuring and radicalizing the Labor Federation, a measure opposed by nationalista and democrata delegates within the Workers' Party and within the Federation. This precipitated a split, with the communists in a rump position when they formally founded the Partido Comunista ng Pilipinas, or PKP, in 1930. The late 1920s ultra-leftism in the Philippines resembled the German communist opposition to the Social Democrats, who were called social fascists. This so-called third period had to achieve socialism by fiat to the extent that it had failed in China, 1927 again. Capitalist collapse was believed imminent, leading to the slogan "After Hitler, us." The Nazis were seen as temporary anti-imperialist allies that the communists could use. The Comintern maintained that the parties in the colonies should work for a democratic dictatorship of the proletariat and peasantry. So looking back to a much earlier and obsolete slogan of Lenin's. The nationalist reformers were considered a barrier to this revolution, and like the social fascists in the West, the primary enemy in the colonies. So the so-called quote-unquote nationalist reformers were seen as analogous to the social democratic social fascists. By the late 1930s, many Filipinos were sympathetic to the idea of an Asia for Asians and the replacement of American with Japanese hegemony. As in Germany, the anti-Kaisung front included pro-Japanese fascists. So the front that was formed was anti-Kazan. Kazan was seen as a nationalist reformer. Hitler's 1933 coup called for a dramatic strategic shift to the so-called Popular Front Against Fascism, fearing the Americans would dump the Philippines to appease Japan, and largely under the guidance of the American CPUSA, or Communist Party USA, but then backing the Roosevelt administration. The PKP reoriented to an anti-fascism that was anti-Japanese above all. In fact, their 1938 platform, Independence, Democracy, and Peace, dropped anti-imperialist demands for support for Kaesung's Commonwealth government. Based on the history of one botched uprising after another, it is possible to conclude that between the three aforementioned events of 1923, the defeat of the German October, or 1923 uprising in Germany, the formation of the Workers' Party of America, and the Partido Obrero's dormancy, the left was able to learn and assimilate little. These failures were returned with compounded interest. 1923 led to the failure of the 1925-27 Chinese Revolution, which the Philippine left inherited when it founded the PKP in 1930, leading in turn to the failure of what was called the Hut Rebellion, which kicked off in the late 40s. Its basis was people in the anti-fascist resistance movement who were associated with the PKP and were effectively marginalized by the Philippines, but with the support of the Americans, which hollowed out the PKP in the 40s and the 50s when they had an uprising. Moving on to the next period, the New Left to the fall of communism from 1968 to 1989. Several New Left historians have traced the decline of the Philippine left to the Old Left. Ken Fuller's three-volume History of the Philippine Left argued that PKP was damaged by the Comintern's 1928 shift to opposing social fascism, which preempted the anti-imperialist United Front he takes as the best possible grounds for national unity, or for left unity more broadly. Social historian Francisco Nemenzo, on the other hand, argued the party's principles were sound until 1938, so between 1930, when the party was formed, 1938, when under the Popular Front, American and Chinese Comintern agents forced a merger with the millenarian peasant-based Socialist Party, another party that had its base in peasant groups. and which had a highly kind of eclectic ideology that Nemenzo characterizes as millenarian. Nemenzo pinned the communist movement's botched uprising a decade later to this merger, which violated the cardinal principle of Leninism, that the party be non-identical to the mass organization. Petty bourgeois radicalism was but one expression of what Nemenzo calls a syndrome, an inventory of symptoms. Very interesting. So he actually uses this kind of idea of symptomology to characterize the old left in the light of its merger with the Socialist Party. Others included dogmatism, symbolic gestures, and quotation mongering, which become counterproductive as the revolutionary process ascends to higher stages, including sudden shifts in the adversary's responses. This is Nemenzo, as he characterizes what the different symptoms are of the syndrome. Nemenzo argued the syndrome could only be overcome by a dialectical process of open debate. And he's writing this in 1984, when the Maoist Communist Party, which I'll be addressing in a second, is entering into a crisis, and which seems to be suddenly characterized by, even more so than it had been previously, a very rigid way of thinking, a dogmatism. This teaching considers the history of global post-Bolshevik Marxism a function of regression rather than advance. The periodic alteration of anti-imperialism and anti-fascism has no clear historical trajectory of advancing to higher stages, as Nemenzo claims. Rather, one follows the other at historical junctures of unclear cause and from failed political judgment. They describe zigzags, historical circumstances for which the left's ideology provided a fig leaf of justification. Strategy was reduced to tactics. Anti-fascism was layered on top of anti-imperialism as debris covering up earlier mistakes. The left made history, but not in the manner of its own choosing. By justifying its politics through national revolution, Stalinist parties like the PKP led not to socialism, but developmental state formation and national economies of scale, paving the way for Third World's integration into a broader Fordist regime of accumulation. Moish Pastone goes so far as to consider traditional Marxism's principal achievement the industrialization of the underdeveloped world. Rather than achieving socialism, they fomented what he calls a capital reconstituting revolution. This process was to be repeated, just as the American New Left was mentored by current and defected members of the Communist Party of America. The PKP, who had finally come out of hiding after its disastrous uprising previously mentioned, revitalized itself in the 1960s by recruiting cadre of self-taught Marxists at the University of the Philippines, including Nemenzo and the future founder of the Communist Party of the Philippines, Jose Maria Sison, known by his nickname Joma. Nemenzo and Sison's New Left generation was initially politicized by Claro Recto's nationalist crusade. So before they encountered Marxism, they encountered this guy, Claro Recto. Recto, having exposed the Nacionalistas' betrayal during the 1924 Fairfield fiasco, emerged as the most militant nationalist during the Philippines' post-war boom. He famously called for national industrial development, quote, by Filipino capitalists, and not simply the prevention of industrialization by foreign capitalists, exploitation of our natural resources by Filipino capital, development and strengthening of Filipino capitalism, not of a foreign capitalism, increase of the national income, but not allowing it to go mostly for the benefit of non-Filipinos. So his formula still, I think, has an element of cosmopolitanism in it, certainly in ways that the New Left taking up his ideas would not, and would be kind of much more vulgar in their nationalism. Recto here describes Fordism, which simply means the need for rationalized state planning. His crusade was part of a broader post-war movement to establish Fordist nation-states in the post-colony. Recto and others like him were inspired by the American Civil Rights Movement, itself exemplifying the extent to which the global order anchored by the New Deal coalition was unraveling. On the heels of civil unrest, including the anti-war movement, the Black Power turn, the strike wave of the late 1960s, and the 1968 Prague Spring, the Filipino New Left replicated somewhat belatedly their counterparts in France, Japan, and the United States. Filipino students were also politicized by the Cuban Revolution, the deepening of the US involvement in Vietnam, the leftward swing of Sukarno's government in Indonesia, and the 1966 Chinese Cultural Revolution. The contours of 1960s radicalism were largely defined by a split within the global communist movement. Following Nikita Khrushchev's 1956 denunciation of Stalin, the Soviets and the Chinese accused one another of revisionism, a dispute that rippled out to parties in other countries. At that time, the Indonesian Communist Party, or PKI, with whom the PKP was developing ties, was in the orbit of Beijing. After the PKI's failed coup and the resulting 1965 massacre, the PKP was pushed into the arms of Moscow, with whom Marcos had restored diplomatic relations. In other words, the communists in the Philippines saw Ferdinand Marcos angling to develop trade relations with the Soviet Union. Therefore, they supported him. Meanwhile, Sissone's faction aligned ideologically and politically with Beijing. His National Democracy, extensively borrowed from Mao's New Democracy, argued that imperialism blocked the flowering of civil society that would be achieved only after national sovereignty has been fully secured and incorporated into a genuinely free national state. Sissone's faction was expelled in 1967. Nemenzo, who was violently suppressed when attempting to establish his own Marxist-Leninist group within the Communist Party, believed that the Maoists were able to demarcate their line of march through a critique of the PKP. So basically, Nemenzo's faction started hiding weapons. This was after, I believe, after the beginning of martial law. So Nemenzo's split happened. His Marxist-Leninist split happens after the Maoists split. But basically, his faction doesn't go anywhere. Some of them are killed by the Stalinists, and he is caught and thrown in jail. So the CPP, or the Communist Party of the Philippines, the New Left or Maoist organization splitting off of the Old Left, opposed America, the comprador bourgeoisie, and the landlord class through anti-imperialism, anti-feudalism, and anti-bureaucrat capitalism. This is what you would hear if you would go to a rally and you would see Maoists. They would be chanting against these three opponents. In so doing, they claimed to stitch together the radicalism of three historical stages. The 1896 revolution in the Philippines, this is when revolution happens, against Spain, itself supposedly contiguous with the French Revolution. They saw a direct line between the French and the Filipino Revolution. They saw them both as being equally bourgeois. The resistance during the Philippine-American War, which happens several years later, of course, and Mao's Cultural Revolution. So each of those isms would correspond to one of these historical periods, right? Anti-imperialism against the Americans, anti-feudalism against, of course, the Spanish, and then anti-bureaucrat capitalism is maybe a different higher stage, which corresponds to the Cold War, and the Cultural Revolution is borrowed from the post-1965 moment. This complex of isms is better encapsulated, however, as anti-fascism, since opposition to Marcos was the glue holding the coalition together. For Sisson, the Philippine Revolution possessed three magic weapons: the party, the National Democratic Front, and the New People's Army, or NPA. And the front was called the NDF. The party was called the CPP. The NDF, or the front organization, was viewed as a shield for the party and the NPA, which was to surround the city from the countryside. Their prolonged People's War was to pass from strategic defensive, stalemate, and then offensive stage. The latter needed a standing army with artillery, a strategy China forswore after winding down the Cultural Revolution. So in other words, Mao had actually approved weapons shipments to the Philippines. They never arrived. There were, I think, 3 separate weapons shipments that all failed. And then, of course, with Mao out, by the end of the Cultural Revolution, China is out of the picture. By no means is it interested in supporting these Filipino Maoists. So the guerrilla force had to instead rely upon its Operation Agos. Agos means arms, Operation Arms, whereby they ambushed and massacred regular troops in order to steal their high-powered rifles. So they would just kill rank-and-file troops and take their rifles and use those. The CPP's theory symptomized an undigested crisis in the global New Left, which crested in 1968. Much like the radicals in the Socialist Party failed to grasp the emergence of Fordism 40 years prior, the New Left's largest American organization, the Students for a Democratic Society, was blindsided by a crisis in the New Deal coalition. Its disorientation metastasized into a politics of defeat in the Maoist-inspired 1970s weather underground. Instead of learning from this crisis, the CPP's line of march was a cipher for the Cultural Revolution, itself a byproduct of Chinese interbureaucratic dispute. As the latter wound down in the mid-70s, the CPP was militarily wiped out, but staged a comeback as the Marcosian state began to petrify, reflecting a wider crisis that would soon sweep away rotten communist regimes and rigidified postcolonial states alike. The Maoists fractured in the 1980s. This is a long process. At the beginning of the split, Nemenza, whose article I mentioned previously, warned that just like the Socialist Party merger, and here I'm referring to Nemenza's reference to the Socialist Party in the Philippines, that millenarian populist socialist party, which merged in 1938. Just like the Socialist Party merger 3 decades prior, the CPP's Popular Front blurred the boundaries between party and mass organization. If the old left's alliance with Marcos prioritized anti-imperialism, the new left, again, on the basis of Marcos's reaching out to the Soviet Union, the new left emphasized anti-fascist resistance. Maoism is a species of anti-fascism that is opposition to Japanese imperialism in China. Unlike China during its war against Japan, the civil war in the Philippines was largely contained to the southern island of Mindanao, and the government operated within the bounds of legitimacy, even after the 1972 declaration of martial law. Civil society, while greatly curtailed, continued to exist, as evidenced by clerical labor organizing and the anti-fascist student movement, itself the progeny of the Marcosian university system, in which the state heavily invested. By 1981, martial law was lifted, allowing a greater degree of protest and debate, giving birth to a burgeoning anti-Marcos People's Front, led by Social Democrats and the CPP's National Democratic Front groups, which I mentioned previously. In practice, the growth engendered by the Anti-Fascist People's Front raised questions about the CPP's adherence to Maoist orthodoxy, largely from within the NDF, or National Democratic Front, whose members and leadership recognized the importance of the urban sphere's operation. Papoy Lagman, one of the leaders of the Manila Rizal Committee, who was not just in the front, but who was a committee member of the Communist Party, but again, who operated within the Manila area, argued that the Philippine left should not have imported the Maoist prolonged peasant war framework, not only because it dates to the Second World War, but because the Philippines is an archipelagic nation, making the surrounding of the cities from the countryside tactically impossible. And this is, of course, aside from the point that I mentioned earlier, which was that the Philippines would have needed support from China or the Soviet Union for those tactics to even be possible. By the early 1980s, figures in the movement like Edgar Jobson called for a shift from the prolonged peasant war to a more nuanced balancing of what he called 3 strategic combinations: the military struggle and the political struggle, the struggles in the countryside and in the cities, and the struggles in the domestic and the international fronts. In a series of Xerox papers, Nathan Kimpo, who wrote under the nom de guerre Marty Villalobos and Omar Tupaz, mounted another critique of Maoist orthodoxy. So these debates were happening, only they were basically sheaves of Xerox paper, which would be passed around from person to person in more or less secret. An important player in the Mindanao theater, Kimpo went beyond Jobson in pushing the idea of a pol mil, or political military framework. Initially based on the Vietnam and Nicaraguan experience, Kimpo's idea was to prioritize the electoral struggle, to which the guerrilla forces would play a support role. Again, this is what was envisioned to have happened in Nicaragua. Kimpo correctly predicted that by boycotting the elections, most critically the 1986 snap elections that triggered a coup and the People Power uprising, the left would be outmaneuvered by other forces and left behind in the course of the revolution. To the extent that military tactics predominated, Kimpo argued, the left didn't even follow Mao in their prolonged peasant war strategy. Instead of pursuing a concrete analysis of the concrete situation, they abstracted Mao's teachings from China and attempted to apply them to the Philippines. Although his prediction about 1986 was borne out, Kimpo underestimated the extent of the left's regression. The Vietnam War that so inflamed the New Left had wound down a decade prior. The postcolonial militarism inspired by the 1952 to 1959 Cuban Revolution had proven a dead end, as evinced by Nicaragua's devolution into civil war in the tail end of the 70s and 1980s. As with the old left during the Sino-Soviet split, the collapse of the Soviet Union divided the new left into those who rejected the Maoist-Leninist party and those who adopted an utterly rigid dogmatism cut adrift from reality. For de Menzo, this was symptomatized by dogmatism, including accusations of revisionism, an insult adopted by the Philippine New Left to shame their opponents. Treating the latter as pure dogma, however, neglected the origins of revisionism in the Second International from 1871 to 1917. The dispute substance was lost on the old left, whose dogmatizations and thought taboos were inherited and compounded upon the CPP's 1968 founding. This layering of unrecognized defeat produced a slew of symptoms, but not from any single recognizable disease. Rather, the left was dead, unable to grasp the change it was effecting in the world, and wallowed in an antinomian swamp of petrified discourse. The greater part of the left doubled down on guerrilla war. This is happening in around 1990, calling itself the reaffirmists or the RAs. Meanwhile, a significant minority, including Logman and Kimpo, were expelled and dubbed the rejectionists. Defeated domestically, the RAs downplayed their anti-fascism in order to shadow box at anti-imperialism. Tactically or strategically, they seem to kind of shift and emphasize anti-imperialism. Well, the RJs, rejectionists, members of whom, like Logman and Kimpo, were accused of being insurrectionists for promoting general strikes during people power, focused on grassroots organizing or retreated into the academe. And I don't have time to go into Logman's faction, but they do attempt to sustain a kind of a Maoist-styled or a Marxist-Leninist party, but on a different basis. But I would characterize it still as grassroots organizing because the political participation that they do engage in is not extremely successful, and they don't attain to the level of strength that the CPP had attained to previously. So moving on to the last and final stage of my discussion, the post-political left, which is from the 1990s to the present. This teaching has argued the left's decline was not merely entropic, but the product of an antinomy between anti-fascism and anti-imperialism. Generations of trauma have accumulated, leaving the failure of the old left and the new left repressed. The left is dead. The left is dead, the political aspirations of its youth forgotten. It is post-political. What remains, lingers on, is a rotten ideological blockage, plugging up the pores by which the left, were it alive, would use to excrete utopias. The absence is not a type of ideology which can be grasped dialectically, false consciousness in the Marxian sense, but only negatively in terms of what is missing. The left is dead, but actively expresses symptoms that trend and repeat in a seemingly endless interregnum. The post-political left is not, in other words, simply dogmatic but antinomian. Historical shards are taken up and brandished by different disciplines or disciples of Marx at one another, as in the exchange between historian Joseph Scalise and CPP founder Joma Sisson just prior to the latter's death. The opening salvo was made by Scalise, whose dissertation research was the occasion for several lectures and articles published by the Socialist Equality Party-run World Socialist website, or WSWS. Scalise claimed that the Philippine left practiced class collaborationism under a Stalinist program, and that is very important. Program is an indication of you have this kind of Trotskyism if they're stressing the program. Under a Stalinist program of socialism in one country, a two-stage revolution, and a bloc of 4 classes. These are what characterized the Stalinist program, according to Scalise. Neither party, old left or new left, could lead the working class since both of their programs were compromised, justifying alliances with sections of the ruling class. Both vacillated, zigzagging from one position to another, repeating mistakes rather than learning from experience. Scalise's main proof was that the CPP and its National Democratic Front groups came to emulate the PKP, or the old left's attitude of support towards Ferdinand Marcos, only now in relation to Duterte. So this is happening right after 2016 or leading up to 2016. Their support was on the basis not only of Duterte's links to the anti-Marcos movement in the 1980s and his relatively convivial relationship with their guerrilla groups in the Davao area, from which Duterte hailed, but most significantly his anti-imperialist attitude. In other words, Duterte's anti-imperialism was a way of appealing to a constituency that was sympathetic to or even part of the New Left. In attempting to foment political and economic ties with China, Duterte stated that he had crossed the Rubicon. This political orientation was welcomed by the RAs, or the reaffirmists, at least until the peace talks broke down. And Duterte added several members associated with the CPP or with its United Front groups to his cabinet, by the way. Sissone's anti-imperialist front with Duterte was decried by Scalise, who wrote, "The task of a revolutionary leadership was to insistently warn of the imminent danger posed by the fascistic Duterte and to organize an independent movement of workers for their own socialist interests." That's, again, Scalise. But the Maoists had already broken with Duterte, folding into an increasingly small opposition, which was oriented towards the Liberal Party and its leader, Lenin Robredo. The Liberals are, at that time and still are, the opposition party. They thereby became the shrillest anti-fascists, ostensibly leading a coalition, but in reality blessed Robredo's Liberal Party with progressive aspirations in the name of resistance. As such, Marxism was used as a theory to justify whatever side they wanted to take in capitalist politics. This was spelled out in RA columnist Marasigan's response to Scalise. He argued the left deals with the national bourgeoisie through a combination of unity and struggle. And his main point of contention with Scalise was that Scalise neglected the difference between the nationalist bourgeoisie and the comprador bourgeoisie. He argued the left deals with the nationalist bourgeoisie through a combination of unity and struggle, so long as the alliance with Duterte was serving the national and democratic rights and interests of the Filipino people. Any contradictions between national groups, such as between, again, the comprador bourgeoisie and the national bourgeoisie, could be strategically leveraged by appealing to progressive patriotism. Sissone's own rejoinder to Scalise spelled out the instrumentalism behind this popular front perspective. In alliance with the middle class, the working class takes advantage of the splits among the reactionaries in order to isolate the right wing and destroy the enemy one after the other. This is Sissone. For Sisson, Leninism meant the people's democratic revolution with the socialist perspective and under the leadership of the working class. As with the Russian and Chinese models, the Philippine Revolution was to inaugurate a socialist stage. Sisson contrasted socialism in one country to Scalise's Trotskyite view of permanent revolution. What he saw as a sort of magical thinking, spontaneous and seamless world revolution, akin to, quote, wanting to reach a mountain summit without any arduous climb. Again, that's Sisson. By contrast, Lenin wrote in his 1922 Notes of a Publicist that the communist movement needed to climb down the mountain in search of another path up. So Sisson basically reverses this formula. In effect, it was an admission the revolution had reached a dead end, a failure that Stalinism's function is to hide. After their brief anti-imperialist alliance with Duterte, the left's resistance has recalled almost to the letter the CPP's anti-fascism of the 1980s. In supporting Aquino and the liberals, the CPP was ushered off the stage of history and absorbed into a pressure group, the extent to which it wasn't already. The same, of course, can be said of Scalise's anti-fascism. Under the guise of appealing to the workers' quote-unquote socialist interests, many of which were quite cogently articulated by Duterte, Scalise promoted the progressive opposition. Yet neither the unemployed victims of the drug war, along with their handlers, the drug pushers, nor the workers' interests are a priori socialistic. They are necessarily a function of capital, which, Marx says, tends on the one hand to create disposable time, on the other to convert it into surplus labor. Both the workers and their antithesis, the reserve army of labor, are dialectical halves that don't add up, due less to the failure of political leadership, as Scalise may think, than the absence of a historically conscious political party for socialism in the face of failure to account for regression. If Sasson's Maoism neglected a concrete analysis of the concrete situation, Scalise similarly applied Trotsky's ideas to the present abstractly. Stalinism's incorrect program could, with the proper revolutionary leadership, be turned around. But Trotsky's Fourth International and the immediate pre-war context in which it was founded are as long gone as the political organizations of Stalinism. Like Sasson's outfit, the CPP, the SEP is but a rump of a rump. Moving on to the final section, regression and democratic revolution. Scalise's idea of the correct program, Nemenzo's discussion of dogmatism, and Fuller's analysis of the anti-imperialist United Front look back to the old left in terms of a crisis in revolutionary leadership, an influx of petty bourgeois utopian socialists into the Marxist Party, or the failure of the party to unite around anti-imperialism. Each thinker sees the new left as a failed attempt to transcend the old. On that they agree. But what if the old left was, at least from 1923, already dead? By framing the old left, 1923 to 1940, as post-Bolshevik Marxism, this teaching specifies regression in terms of the liquidation of the Leninist party. Nemenzo argues the latter must be distinct from its social base, but does not explain why. For Trotsky, the Bolsheviks were never identical with the working class, the masses, the Soviets, or the nation. This was because Bolshevism was not merely organizing the working class in terms of organic socialist interests, Scalise, but as the conscious factor in history. A revolutionary situation inevitably precipitates crisis and division within the party in the transition from preparatory revolutionary activity to the immediate struggle for power. That's Trotsky. In 1923 Germany, the political destabilization meant a rapid shift in methods of work and strategic orientation by some, at the same time leading others to double down on tried and true tactics. The communist thought was not merely dogmatic, but reified, unable to take stock of conditions that it had, in part, brought about. Unlike Nemenzo's idea of petty bourgeois radicalism infecting the party from without, again, the Socialist Party merger with the communists in 1938, for Trotsky, 1914 to 1917 was a crisis arising from within. In this view, the party was not merely a site of rational debate, but a division within rationality, an elevated locus or prism of crisis expressed within the party in tension with its success in transforming the world around it. Trotsky here followed Lenin's idea of a vanguard party by contrast with Kautsky's Second International Party of the Whole Class, an organization encompassing all socialists. Kautsky's students, Lenin, Luxemburg, and Trotsky, had followed the revisionist dispute to its ultimate conclusion. While the revisionists saw in the mass party's success potential for leading the rest of society to socialism, the orthodox wing saw the movement as extending and exacerbating capitalism's crisis. Extending this premise amidst what he called the age of imperialism, Lenin believed that a split in the workers' movement for socialism is a precondition for revolution. And this is a formulation that the Sparts come to from a study of Lenin and Trotsky. For Lenin, imperialism was not the exploitation by the core of the periphery around which common progressive a common progressive coalition could be made, but rather a historical epoch involving the transformation of competition into monopoly as a function of capitalism. It forced capitalists kicking and screaming into a new transitional order from complete free competition to complete socialization. That's Lenin. Yet in this highly socialized and cosmopolitan order, the means of production remained private property, an explosive contradiction that begged for a global political solution. It was not merely the 1917 October Revolution, but the revolution in Germany that Lenin counted on to guarantee its scope and historical significance. In 1917, the Mensheviks, a minority faction in Russian social democracy, argued against taking power in favor of defending the gains of the revolution. Reconciling with non-working class leadership required theoretical justification, and the Mensheviks turned to Marx's dictum that, quote, the country that is more developed industrially only shows to the less developed the image of its own future. They concluded that Russian socialism should follow the path of development taken in England, France, and Germany, with the bourgeoisie in power and the social democrats in opposition. The Mensheviks considered the 1917 February Revolution, which was led by the socialist revolutionaries, a bourgeois revolution. The Mensheviks and even many old Bolsheviks promoted defensism, what Lenin called defensism, leading Lenin to repudiate the old democratic dictatorship of the proletariat and peasantry slogan, which the Comintern would cite 10 years later in its policy for the colonies during the ultra-left period. Lenin, adopting Trotsky's program of permanent revolution, argued February was a bourgeois revolution that came too late. Under the imperialist epoch, bourgeois revolutions did not simply extend in an unbroken chain from one country to another. If the bourgeois revolutions of 1776 and 1789 gathered the nation together like a lion preparing to spring, the regime established by the February Revolution was torn apart by internal contradictions. Instead of the bourgeois nation opposing feudalism, imperialism was the proletariat against the bourgeois nation. Under imperialism, Russian democracy was, rather than a bourgeois liberation struggle, simply the masses. In Russia, the petty industrial and commercial bourgeoisie, the intelligentsia, and the peasantry. The direction of the changes in these relations of production in the democratic revolution produced a disintegrating rather than a unifying effect. Trotsky, like Lenin, was well aware that the revolution had affected the transition to the commune only in the most backward corner of the world. In this, they followed Marx and Engels, who state that communism presupposes the universal development of productive forces and the world intercourse bound up with them. Classes would be eliminated only by eliminating want and scarcity. While the dictatorship of the proletariat, imagined only as a very brief interlude, might be established in an isolated and backward country, socialism could occur only through the joint efforts of multiple advanced countries. With the establishment of socialism, the state was to begin withering away immediately, its parasitic bureaucracy gutted, the army to consist of the armed working class, the party giving way to the self-governing activity of the masses. Instead, a single party dominated, serving as what Trotsky calls the juridical point of departure for the Stalinist totalitarian regime. This was not due to any innate qualities in Bolshevism, but rather in the number of defeats of the proletariat in Europe and Asia. By contrast with Lenin, Luxemburg and Trotsky's view of the historical necessity and impossibility of democracy and liberalism, Philippine Maoists believed that a people's revolution would produce a state that abolished semi-colonial and semi-feudal conditions, laying the ground for socialism. In this, they repeated the Menshevik argument for supporting the National Revolutionary Party. The fate of the Philippine left was bound up with the American Old Left. If the Socialist Party of America, rather than the progressives, had managed to successfully appeal to the populist discontents of the Gilded Age, while navigating the split within Marxism in the age of imperialism, Stalinist progressivism might not have existed for the Philippine left to emulate. After a century of counter-revolution, however, an account of the left in the Philippines must emphasize the regression of the old left, its repetition in the new, and the antinomian post-political situation today. So this concludes my presentation. Do those of you who are left have any questions or comments?
I have a few questions if I go first.
Please.
I think I'll just ask two for now. First, I'm wondering like what motivated you to prepare this teaching? I presume since your research has been going for a long time, but like secondary to that is it related to there's like a Maoism today, like among Zoomers, and what I've noticed is that a lot of these Mao Zoomers will look to the Filipino Communist Party, right? They'll really admire that, and they'll say at least they're struggling. There's still a socialist movement. There's still a living socialist movement, and it might not be perfect, but at least it exists in the Philippines. So I'm wondering if it's related to that.
Def
Um,
yeah.
and yep.
Go.
And like a second, yeah, and I'll just add in. I have more questions, but not to stack too many at one time. Um, Let me try to remember. Um, I guess there was this theme that came up throughout your teaching about like liquidating the party into the movement, like this problem, which kind of comes up in the 80s, also but it appears in like the 30s with like the anti-imperialism against Japan, I think, although I could be wrong, but like the anti-fascism against Marcos, and how, yeah, could you, I just hope you could elaborate on that, what that what that really means to liquidate the party into the movement.
Okay, yeah, thanks for those questions. So to answer the first one, what inspired the presentation? It was actually commissioned by Kevin Dong to give to the Anak Bayan chapter in Santa Cruz. So Anak Bayan means son of the nation in Filipino. It's a front group for the Communist Party in the Philippines. So they have had a kind of a moment of expansion. They did a lot of organizing during the Duterte period, like kind of anti-fascist coalition building, mostly amongst Philams in the United States. And they had a little bit of a burst or a spurt in the Philippines too. So it's definitely, by now, it's definitely petered out here in the States and had previously kind of run out of steam in the Philippines. It didn't go too far. But the idea was to give this discussion as a kind of a lecture about the history of the Philippine left to this Anak Bayan chapter in Santa Cruz. So we've been kind of seeing Anak Bayan pop up in a few other areas where platypus is. So I thought it might be useful for those chapters too. However, ultimately we were not able to push through with the engagement. So we decided to just have this as an online event that could be posted for others to view at a future date. Now, as far as Zoomer Maoism, Anak Bayan is part of that, but so I haven't had contact with them personally. I haven't been at a university where there's an Anak Bayan chapter, and I haven't been able to interact much with them. But I could see it as I was leaving Santa Cruz already. I could see some like anti-Duterte politics percolating up amongst the kind of Philam folks who are usually organized in some chapter as an affinity group on campuses. So I didn't have direct contact with it, but I knew its origins. And now it does also appear that we haven't encountered really any kind of theoretically oriented Zoomers coming out of this Anak Bayan milieu. So we're not exactly sure why. They tend to play their cards pretty close to the chest. I think the people that the CPP folks recruit are probably few and far between, and they are probably instructed to not be very vocal about their Marxism. The ideological training they get is probably not very good either. So the Zoomers that we're encountering are coming from elsewhere. They seem to be more along the lines of autodidacts. I did encounter a Zoomer autodidact who had linked up with, what's his name? Greg Lucero, who apparently has a kind of a fandom, an online fandom, and this Santa Cruz student was aware of, familiar with Lucero. So it's not pure, it's probably not pure autodidacticism. I think there are kind of online groups where there is some attempt to train the younger generation, but we really haven't been able to delineate the contours of how this is happening exactly. So I don't think it's purely organic, although it seems to be largely organic. We had CJ come to the convention last year from Santa Cruz. So you'd have to ask Kevin about where he was kind of getting all of his interest in Maoism from. So definitely we've seen this kind of Zoomer Maoism happening. Somebody, I think Andoni encountered a group in Corvallis who's publishing a journal that's more theoretical in its orientation. So it's definitely in the air. And as you say, yeah, they often, some of these Zoomers, and CJ definitely did it. People at other panels as well have referred to the Communist Party of the Philippines. So that's definitely been going on. And so I kind of wanted to intersect that. And then in terms of the third question, the liquidation of the party into the movement. So yes, it does happen. It happens in the 30s, happens in the 80s, and now Scalise is claiming that it's happening again in the SEP affiliated intellectual who I mentioned, Joseph Scalise, claims that it's happening again after a fashion in the Duterte period. But he's focused more on this question of program rather than the relationship between the party and the movement. I was really picking up not so much on him, but on this other academic leftist intellectual that I mentioned, Francisco de Menzo. So he wrote an article in 1984, just before People Power, which is in 1986. And he looks back to the old left and he locates this moment of liquidation in 1938 when the Comintern forces a merger between the Socialist Party, this peasant-based Socialist Party, and the PKP, or the old left, Partido Comunista ng Pilipinas, and raises this problem of the relationship between the party and the mass movement. He's writing, of course, in the 1980s, so his concern is probably actually with the Maoists, the CPP, the Communist Party of the Philippines, relationship to the National Democratic Front. And that is where the crisis initiates. It really is a crisis that seems to occur, first of all, with respect to how the United Front is supposed to relate to the party. And then later, of course, there are problems within the United Front itself. These would be non-members of the Communist Party. People who are candidate members, like Joel Rocamora, who I've interviewed, I haven't been able to publish it yet, are the ones who are really starting to criticize the party. So he kind of comes out of the United Front maybe in a way that Kimpo doesn't, or the other guy that I mentioned, Papoy Lagman. So some people are thinking about it, but that's not the only problem that people are identifying. So I don't know if that completely answers your question or not about those 3 points, or specifically the question about the United Front.
No, I think that answers. Thank you.
Lola, do you have a comment you want to say? Or do you want me to read it aloud? Lola, are you there? Well, she did send me a text, and she said, I cannot give any reaction from the lecture. They mentioned data of 50 years old or so. In general, he did not say anything new from what we already knew from the Philippine left. It seems that the left was a failure from the beginning to now, caused by the left was a failure from the beginning to now, caused by a failure of leadership. So there's a sentence, in general, he did not say anything new that we didn't already know. The left was a failure from the beginning to now caused by a failure of leadership. That was her comment.
Yeah, thanks for that comment. So that's not what I said. That's what Scalise said, Joseph Scalise said. I was making a different argument, which was I was raising this problem of regression. So whereas Scalise kind of distills the problem in the Philippine left today down to this problem of revolutionary leadership, taking this kind of hypostatized Trotskyist view and applying it to today. I was raising the problem of regression. In other words, that the problem is much earlier and it predates even the old left. So that's where 1923 was an important date for me. 1923 is kind of maybe the moment of no return, where the failures are not accounted for, but rather neglected, not processed, or papered over with some kind of hagiographic or triumphalist theory of the moment in which the left finds itself. Now, I do recall a lecture that Scalise was giving where he was asked by Alessandro Claudio about the whether or not the old left was or the new left were kind of damaged goods from the very beginning, right? Which is maybe implicit in your friend's question, right? That this is kind of like a tautological presentation where I just say everything was wrong. The failure happened from the very beginning. There wasn't a reason for it. I don't identify the reason for it. That's how I'm interpreting the comment. And so to this question of the old left, Scalise says, no, they just had the wrong program. It wasn't rotten from the very beginning. So I'm not saying that. I'm saying it was rotten from the very beginning. That is my argument.
Well, the comment that she's making is actually that the failure from the beginning to now, I'd say that she's agreeing with the idea that it was a problem of leadership, right? So that the problem from the beginning to now was the failure of its leadership, right? Not that it failed from the beginning, but rather that the reason why it's continued to fail was because of its leadership, and that you can't say anything because to her it's like that failure is something she experienced in the past 50 years, right?
Yeah.
And that it seems what I'm thinking in the back of my head is how not just the way that I'm thinking about it, but for example, more broadly, like the Spartacus League, for example, how they kind of, when their reorientation away from their programs, they look back to the 90s, right? And they said to themselves, like, we should have done something different in the 90s. And that for them, and I think for a lot of people, it's distilled back to that experience, right? So it feels like a lot of your teaching really ends in the 90s with the split in the Communist Party. And so what about the past 20 years?
So two things. Again, I would say it's not about the failure of leadership. It's about the problem of regression. So hopefully I've made that point clear. I think that, and I don't think we have a disagreement on this point, but I just want to drive the point home for your friend. It's the inability to deal with the problem of failure that then has these compounding problems that make things even more complicated. For instance, one of the formulas that I had taken from Chris Cutrone is that you have anti-imperialism and then you have anti-fascism, and they're sort of piled up and undifferentiated from another as this kind of wreckage from the past that just rearticulates itself in this almost unthinking, spontaneous way. So that's not leadership, right? That's not a question of leadership. That's the regression thesis that I'm posing, which is different. So maybe I haven't articulated it very well, but that's where I would differentiate what I'm saying from this problem of failed leadership.
I have another thing.
Sure.
Myself. which is I feel like part of the reason that, I just think of how the sustained militant actions by the guerrillas and amongst the Maoists is really about whether or not, like, their illegal activity prevents them from participating in bourgeois society more deeper, but also they want to reject bourgeois society. They want to stay outside of it. And so legality versus illegality becomes rarefied into counterposed principles. And during this year's convention, we brought someone of the same tendency as C.J. Hunt and a Gonzaloite and Jordan, and he framed it as above ground, underground, and that the importance of revolutionary action is primarily that of the underground. I think that's part of the reason why it's difficult to get Maoists, is because they consciously identify with the illegal activity of the Communist Party in it as an illegal ism, right? As like a way of rejecting bourgeois society, of staying outside of it. That's one of the things I feel like part of the reason why people are reaching towards Filipino Maoists. So my Lola has another comment. She says that she's still listening. Can you elaborate that? I can elaborate that the leadership from the beginning were not fully convinced of their ideological position. They were just reacting to what was then the social condition. When the condition changed, the leadership could not adapt.
Yes, that's right. And that's a point that Nemento is making as well in this 1984 article. But I just add a second layer, or there's another fillip to it for me, which is this problem of regression. So it's not just that you have this kind of ascending historical process, which ascends to higher and higher phases, and the left is left behind when their leadership can't adapt. But you have these kind of compounding symptoms that then make it more and more difficult over time for the left to recorrect or to kind of reconcile itself with what has happened in the past and how it has repressed, to use a psychological term, has repressed its own history. And I guess that's part of the problem of regression that I was trying to point to as well. But that's a very good point. And I think it's absolutely true.
In my mind, I'm comparing this distinction, anti-fascism versus anti-imperialism, to, this is me, by the way, the German left, where it seems like you're kind of explicating this as an inability to, that it obviates the distinction and vacillates between the two. While I feel like there's like people who are rigidly anti-fascist as opposed to rigidly anti-imperialist. Of course, as sort of principled, quote unquote, Trotskyists, the Scalia, it seems you're describing, is like firmly anti-fascist, and therefore is not so different than when the Maoists turn towards Robredo. But I feel like they might illustrate that. I don't know. Like I'm just making a distinction between the way that you're presenting it as that they're like obscuring the difference and going between the two, as opposed to taking a firm stance one way or the other. Because there are two ways that usually takes place, right? Either firm stance one way or the other, or going from one to the other and kind of zigzagging.
Well, it seems to be that in these kind of moments of historical shift, that then the ideological shift also happens. So what I was proposing was that the Maoists left was more anti-fascist and the old left was more anti-imperialist, right? So you have this, and so that's overlapping. And it has to do with an orientation both towards politics of the present moment. And the way that I put it was they're going to support this or that capitalist politician, right? So it has to do with the politics of the present moment, but also of the past. So the old left is kind of more firmly ensconced in this popular front, in this kind of anti-imperialism, the third period Stalinism, and then the popular frontism. And then whereas the new left, the CPP, has this more sort of anti-fascist orientation. So there's a historical vector as well as questions of political expediency or opportunism, like which capitalist politician are you going to support? And then that can change. So over time, so I don't know if vacillate is the right term, because one thing that Scalise argues, which is interesting, is well, he kind of distills it down to revolutionary leadership. So the old left doesn't have the proper program and the proper revolutionary leadership. So they kind of, zigzag and vacillate. The same thing happens, and so they end up supporting Marcos. The new left, the same thing happens. They end up supporting Duterte. He says first is tragedy, then is farce. But I'm saying, well, the old left, that one of the things that I'm saying is, well, maybe there's something tragic to the old left, to be sure, and something somewhat farcical to the new left. That's fine. But there's a deeper problem, and you can't just come in with the right program or the right leadership and correct things. So with the new left, it does seem to be the case that they are more anti-imperialist at first, and then they're more anti-fascist at first, I'm sorry. And then after the 1986 revolution, they take a more kind of anti-imperialist bent, and then they come back to this anti-fascism. So it's flip-flopping, but in this like kind of period of years or even a decade that this switch happens. So I don't know if that helps. As far as the last 20 years, I had a whole section about this debate between Scalise and Sisson. This all happened in the past couple of years, right before Sisson died. So I guess, yes, I am missing a gap between basically 1990 and 2022. But yeah, so I don't know if that period is even important to address, or to what extent it is. My claim was that it's characterized by this kind of antinomianism, and Scalise is one shard, and Sisson is another shard. So it's just this kind of incoherence and fragmentation, more so than prior periods.
Yeah, I have a final comment from her, which is that the Philippine left eventually became a cult. They revolved around their supposed idol, but when opposers spoke, there were very little tolerance. So the Philippine left split in so many ways, so it is now dead as in buried, no way it could be resuscitated.
Yeah. And this is where you can't make an appeal to the correct program or the correct leadership. So yeah, so my talk is more of a kind of an excavation or an attempt to read history against the grain, not with the aim of resuscitating the dead left, but just to attempt to learn something from the way in which it presents itself as Marxism, to try to learn from how it's called itself Marxist in the past. So yeah, this has to do with the idea in Platypus of attempting to understand Marxism by grasping its absence, how absent Marxism is. So that's the purpose of the history. Yeah.
I want to ask a question about something you brought up, which is the historical conceptualization that the Philippine left has about Filipino history. So you mentioned like 1896 being like the bourgeois revolution, I forget, against feudalism, against Spain, right? Then 1900 is anti-imperialist, against imperialism, and then I forget what's the last. There was one more, against bureaucrat capitalism. Was it people power against bureaucrat capitalism?
I'm just associating it with the Cultural Revolution period. So I guess you could say
the Cultural Revolution.
65, yeah.
Right. So yeah, I just want to I want to ask about that, like what you and then you mentioned at the end, like how bourgeois revolutions aren't just like going from country to country.
Mhm.
So yeah, I hope you could elaborate on that because like so what then in that case, what is 1896 if not a bourgeois revolution?
Oh, yeah,
And what is 1900 if not an anti-imperialist struggle? Right, like to play the devil's advocate.
absolutely.
How else would you describe these events?
Right. So I am drawing from Trotsky's Lessons from October, which is heavily used in a pamphlet written by the Spartacist League called Lenin and the Vanguard Party. So they so Trotsky makes the argument, and it's completely in line with arguments that Lenin would make as well, and that Luxemburg would make. And I'm characterizing these three thinkers as the orthodox proponents within the revisionist dispute, which I also mentioned earlier. The revisionist dispute, which crops up in Maoist accusations against their opponents of revisionism. So 1896. So why is it not a bourgeois revolution? So yeah, it has to do also with how Maoism understands contradiction versus how Trotsky understands contradiction. The moment of 1896 wouldn't be a bourgeois revolution because it follows the 1848 revolution in France, which is the foundational moment for Marx and Engels, where they understand that the working class cannot lead the rest of liberal society in this communist revolution, but rather that in the process of making a revolution, you would have this kind of disintegration of society. So whereas revolutions prior to this Marxian moment of 1848 could have an authentic bourgeois content in which, if we recall 1776 and 1789, the bourgeoisie leads the other classes and instantiates the nation. It's a cohesive effect. After Marx's moment of 1848, you have rather this disintegrative effect to revolution. So it's not possible for the working class to take the place of the bourgeoisie and lead the rest of society in quite the same way. So if we go up to the revolution against Spain in 1886, it cannot be a bourgeois revolution because we've already progressed on an international historical level quite a long ways into this Marxian moment that Marx called capital. So the entire kind of possibilities that capitalism presents as a phenomenon emerging out of this kind of 1848 moment is one in which this question of the dictatorship of the proletariat is posed. So the content of revolution has been transformed into one which seems to have this dictatorial trajectory. Either the revolution will resolve itself in a dictatorship of Louis Napoleon Bonaparte, who comes to power in a coup after the revolution, being elected president, and then staging the coup after the revolution, being elected president, and then staging a coup to retain himself in power. And in the 18th Brumaire of Louis Napoleon, Marx points out that bourgeois fanatics for order are shot down on their own balconies. So we cannot say that bourgeois revolution has happened if the bourgeoisie is being shot down on their own balconies by drunken soldiers who are Bonaparte's troops. So it's very much mistaken to think that you can simply have a bourgeois revolution. Now, this is not to say that there's not a bourgeois revolutionary character to the revolution of 1896. However, it's going to be disintegrative and contradictory in ways that the American and the French revolutions were not. That's the point that I'm raising, and the way that Sassone and the Maoists kind of take up these contradictions is they think that they can kind of deal with them one by one, and work through them one by one, instead of countenancing the kind of this broader problem of regression from the failure of the communist revolution in Marx's time, right? Regression from the failure of the revolution in Lenin's time. But within that regression, or within that counter-revolution, there's also this revolution. There is this bourgeois revolution. So the bourgeois revolution is sustained, only it has to be reproduced every time it fails. Every time it fails, the question of the working class under capitalism is not resolved, and you have what I referenced in the paper as a capital constituting revolution, where capitalism is reconstituted in a new form. In the footnotes of my presentation, I took it out of the presentation proper. There's this Filipino academic, Randy David, who was part of, and this would get to, Curtis, your question about the left after the 1990s. There's the independent socialists. So I was just referencing this guy, Kimpo, who was basically a Maoist. He becomes part of the independent socialists. Randy David is another one. And I honestly haven't been able to really entirely figure out what their ideology is. They do have some success, political success. I haven't had a chance to really, I've worked with some of them, but I haven't really had a chance to interview their ideologues. And I hope you get a chance to interview Ronald Llamas someday, Curtis, because I think he might shed some light on this question. They didn't leave a lot of much of a record, whereas the debate that was happening in the late 80s and the 90s took place in, like, I have scanned copies of these Xerox debates. They were published in this journal called Debate, Philippine Left Review. I have copies of the debate that was happening within the independent socialists. I think there's not much of a record of. So that history is kind of lost. They had this sort of grassroots character on the one hand, and then this electoral character on the other. They ended up setting up an independent party called Akbayan, and they were rather successful for a number of years under the party list system that was baked into the Philippine Constitution, the new constitution that was written after '86. But then they were sort of, Llamas became an advisor to President Nonoy Aquino. So this would have been the Aquino years are 2010 to 2016. And so that was a sort of moment of Akbayan's liquidation into the Liberal Party, I guess. So it could be treated. There's something to say about that.
Well, you know, the Akbayan is the rejectionist largest group. It just seems to me that both, you know, I read something by Llamas years ago when I was a teenager, and he made the argument that I never forgot, even though I forgot where he wrote it, which is that both the rejectionists and the reaffirmists, even though they kind of presented themselves on strategic terms, that it's like, oh, which tactics do we prefer? Which strategic orientation will we do? In the end, both of them actually maintained the same tactics. And ultimately, that meant the same strategy, which is that, on the one hand, militant action, you know, the guerrilla warfare, whatever, and on the other hand, civil society organizing. And that, like, actually, and that was something that Sison brings up in opposition to Scalia, which is that, you know, the alliances with various sections of society, various sections of the masses, he says, various class forces, is basically the 90s, the Maoists organizing civil society in the Philippines. And that, like, the way that the Maoists organized civil society in the Philippines wasn't unique to the Philippines, but was true throughout the world, and especially in Latin America too, where a lot of assorted, you know, not necessarily members of the Communist Party, but people who are fellow travelers, perhaps members of the National Democratic Front, or even not even just that, but just, you know, fellow travelers, became the foundations for neoliberal democracy in the 90s, and the NGO apparatus that emerged in the aftermath of the collapse of the Marcos dictatorship in '86.
Mm-hmm.
Anyways, It does seem that right now what's going on with Duterte and Roberta, at least to me, is the inability for the Maoist left to actually navigate through the world that they themselves created, which is neoliberal democracy. That, of course, like the rest of the altered globalization left of the 90s, they were firmly opposed to globalization, albeit saw potential in it, and so built the foundations for neoliberal democracy, even though they were opposed to neoliberalism per se. And now they're the final defenders of it, just like in the rest of the world.
Mm-hmm.
What the left had become these past 5-10 years. I had another comment. Oh yeah, Desmond. I remember looking at a cartoon from the Americans during the Filipino-American War, and they basically had like a caricature of the leader of the Katipunan, the Philippine revolutionaries of the 1890s and early 1900s, as Napoleon. But like the generalissimo of the revolutionaries, he became their leader by executing his factional rival, was accused by the Americans of just wanting to install himself as a military dictator. Of course, the Americans led the revolution anyways and installed their own kind of Bonapartist regime too. But I think that the Maoists kind of think of Aguinaldo, though they prefer the person that Aguinaldo executed.
Bonifacio, yeah.
Bonifacio, yeah. As a kind of like the equivalent of the Sun Yat-sen of the Philippines, but actually like a mix of Sun Yat-sen and what's his name, the leader of the Taiwanese, Chiang Kai-shek, because Aguinaldo eventually became not just a collaborator with the Americans, but also the Japanese.
Japanese, yeah.
Yeah, and so Aguinaldo has an ambiguous legacy, not just on the left, but on the just broad Philippine consciousness. Because of that, yeah.
And that's case in point to Desmond's question about why is an 1896 a bourgeois revolution, right? You would have gotten Aguinaldo as a dictator if the Americans hadn't come in. Also, what you would have gotten, and I mentioned this reference to Benedict Anderson, is that the Philippines would have really just broken up into 3 separate caudillo-ridden states, like as happened in Latin America. But the fact that there was American imperialism, it allowed the country to kind of cohere and to become a nation proper. So that is the alternative to whatever other kind of dictatorial regime you would have. So the upshot of any revolution, if the extent to which it doesn't have a successful Marxian socialist movement that's able to kind of navigate the contradictions that they encounter along the way, you just get some kind of authoritarian regime in its place in a country like the Philippines. That would be, I guess, in response to your question, Desmond. Randy David, who I mentioned earlier, his critique was that so there's anti-fascism, anti-imperialism, and anti-bureaucrat capitalism, and then of course anti-feudalism. But David says you can't have half is not a dialectical position, right? So it's like we're halfway this and we're halfway that, but it doesn't make sense. It's not like a dialectical proposition. So Trotsky's argument is you have combined and uneven development. You have underdevelopment in certain corners of the world. At the same time, right next to it, you have overdevelopment. So, I mean, if you visit Manila, it's pretty evident and on display anywhere you go. You have immigrants from the provinces in shanty towns next to the gleaming condominiums of the Manila Llenos. So combined and uneven development is just one symptom of capitalism, in addition to this other problem of the disintegrative effects of revolution under capital that would need a Marxist mass party to guide it. But that Marxist mass party would have to deal with this problem of revisionism that I also attempted to discuss, which is to say a split within the Marxian movement for socialism.
All right. On my, just to like put a comment on my last question, part of the reason I asked it is because from your presentation, but Maoists and Stalinists generally, they have this funny thing where they say like they call like the past revolution successful bourgeois revolution, right? But then they say we need another bourgeois revolution. Like they will still maintain we need like new democracy, we need national, what is it, national democracy, right? We need
So
a block of four classes. Yeah. So even though they in their own historiography they think there was a bourgeois revolution, they nonetheless call for like another again.
Well, they do deal with it in a way, and I guess it's kind of interesting. The problem for them is that the revolution was crushed by American imperialism. So you have this failed revolution, and then that's compounded by American imperialism, which is then compounded by this kind of Cold War period, and the anti-bureaucrat capitalism is kind of like stacked on top of that. So the entire kind of capital regime, they have to deal with that too. So they are sort of trying to deal with this sort of trajectory that is historically complexified because of but of course they're over the course of a century, but their solution is to just make this sort of bourgeois revolution. But of course it's opportunistic, because what they're really doing is not bourgeois revolution, but they're attempting to basically pit one nationalist group against another and then deal with them one by one. So that's why I brought in this kind of discussion between Scalise and Sisson, where and Marasigan, who says, well, Joseph Scalise doesn't know what he's talking about. He doesn't even know the difference between the bureaucrat capitalists and the nationalist bourgeoisie. What you do it, and so then of course he's not explicit about it. And Sisson's like, no, what you do is you have an alliance with the nationalist bourgeoisie, and then this allows you to knock off the comprador bourgeoisie, and then you turn around and you take care of the nationalist bourgeoisie. So it's a purely opportunistic patriotism, but then the mask becomes the real face, and especially in the United Front. And they don't do really rigorous cadre training. They don't even do extensive study of like Maoist theory. It's like the Little Red Book was what most people were reading in the 1980s. So even the cadre don't necessarily have this clear notion of how they're supposed to be using the other social groups.
I have one last question, unless Curtis wants to ask.
No, you can say it.
Yeah, I guess as like a last question from me at least. Like you started off your presentation very optimistically, saying that the Philippines could have been used to extend world revolution into Asia, and then yet you ended your presentation extremely pessimistically with the left. The left is not only dead today, but it's post-Bolshevik Marxism. It's been dead since 1923. So I mean, trying to formulate this into a question. So what is the Philippines today, I guess? What does the Philippines mean in world in terms of the world? Like, could we say that the Philippines is still an opportunity to extend world revolution into Asia? Because to say it today seems very ludicrous, right? Like, what are we talking about?
I guess
maybe the Maoists, they want to, yeah.
No, that's a very good question. And so part of what I was doing was not just blaming the left in the Philippines, but I was also putting the onus on the American left. I mean, it's the problem, and that's where I closed it off, was with reference back to the American left not being able to kind of navigate this revolutionary moment that Lenin called imperialism, the highest stage of capitalism, and it just splits apart. I was going to show a clip from the film Reds, where the Socialist Party, it shows the Socialist Party having this split, and then there are two factions who claim to be communists arguing with each other and splitting again. And this is the kind of the moment that the Americans navigate in a they've totally failed and botched it. But if they hadn't, then there would have been a kind of a different engagement in the Philippines, which had its own socialist movement and an authentic workers movement, but which wasn't very highly industrialized. And it could have very easily gone in a different direction. So what does that mean for America and its relation to the Philippines today? Well, I think we would probably have to account for the absence of Marxism, right? In this negative way that I've been proposing, we'd have to raise this problem of regression and attempt to understand what Marxism was, to work through its desiderata, through its fragments, through its symptoms and pathologies as expressed on the dead left today, in order to orient ourselves towards the future and what to do next. So I'm taking up this claim of Platypus that we're in a pre-political moment, and the best that we can do is kind of attempt to assess Marxism as this kind of negative absence before any political step could be taken. Now, the extent to which that happens and it is possible and successful, then absolutely. I mean, there are so many Filipinos in America today and Filipino Americans, like the linkages are massive. It'd be like so easy to set up a socialist party in the Philippines if you were able to leverage all of those linkages. I mean, but there's definitely a lot of impediments to that, not least of which is this like 100 years of counter-revolution that I'm kind of attempting to parse.
So I have like two comments. One is, when I was a teenager when the Spratly Island happened, and the teacher kind of brought up how the strategic orientation of the Filipino Maoists was reliant on military armaments from China. And so there's a way that the Philippine Revolution was actually reliant on the revolution in continental Asia rather than the other way around. Just as much earlier that the revolution in the Philippines is reliant on the revolution in America, right? And that the Spratly Island dispute, to me, the inability of the left to actually, like Lenny Robredo is pro-America, while Duterte was kind of sort of pro-China. And they went from being intransigently opposed to China to being, supporting China against America to supporting America against China. And it seemed to me that this movement actually presented how reliant the national revolution was in respect to the international situation. But even just a nationalist revolution would require socialist revolutions in China and the United States. The other thing that I want to comment on, what I find frustrating about Filipino American nationalism and its reliance upon the nationalism in the Philippines is how like the Philippines could become like a center for an international socialist party. And yet and that would require connections with Filipino Americans that would have cross-national solidarity between workers between nations rather than just organizing within one's own lane. Like, I feel like part of the reason why Anak Bayan is resistant against engaging with Platypus is because we're not Filipino. That's it, right? Like, to the extent which we're not Filipino, we're not also a nationalist group that will support the national revolution in the Philippines. Just like, oh, go nationalism, go,
And that's an impediment.
Yes.
Yeah.
It's an impediment even to their own politics.
Mm-hmm. As far as, I mean, I would agree. And as far as, and of course, it's not just the left, but this nationalism it's also a product of like primary education in the Philippines. And so it's drilled into, I mean, it's gotten kind of crazy too. It's, I don't know if they still do this, but under Duterte, you had to stand up and sing the national anthem before a movie. So, there's peaks and ebbs, I guess, of how nationalism is reinforced. But one other point that I tried to bring up in the presentation was not only is it the American Revolution that's motivating the Philippine Revolution, but also the Democrats and Democratic Party progressive anti-imperialism. So I tried to kind of thread through that history to a certain extent. It's motivating Aguinaldo to harass the American troops. Well, the Maoists kind of do the same thing. It's the idea of reformism with guns. Like they can affect policy amongst the progressive capitalists in America by this or that action, I guess, if not locally. And then the progressives are really, the Anti-Imperialist League and the progressives and people like Brian are really pushing forwards Filipino nationalism. Not to say that it's not there, but they're giving it strength. They're strengthening it. And of course, Wilson wants to and Wilson's Democratic wing wants to just liberate the Philippines, and it could have happened, but if not for the political situation in the Philippines, but also more importantly, this kind of conflict between the Republicans and the Democrats, which was playing out on the international stage. So it's like this kind of international war within American democracy that's then sort of rearticulated in Asia that I was kind of interested in looking at. And you can say that you can say that, and this is one of the points that Aaron Neto was making, the dissertation that I cited, is that the Philippine old left is really just a continuation of the national struggle. Like it's actually not really communist, it's just nationalist. And they're just doing what, the Anti-Imperialist League had previously supported. So it's not just China, and they are trying to like send weapons and stuff over to the Chinese nationalist movement to the Philippines, is, I guess, in the late 1890s, but also the American progressives as well. And that's what leftists are doing today, right? And that's the legacy, that's the kind of the problematic legacy of the new left, to just provide moral support or ideological cover for the left in the Philippines. So of course we would have to deal with that question too, through this process of organizing the symptomology on the left, dealing with, again, with this question of regression. So that would be the immediate course of action from Platypus's perspective that could be done, that might redound upon the left in the Philippines in some kind of secondary ways. Any other comments or questions?
I guess I have a small question. It was based on like a offhand remark you made in your presentation. I know this is not very climatic to ask this minor, but you mentioned this like radical nationalists in the 60s, like Rutko, something like this.
Yeah, Clara Recto. Yeah, he's been around since he was on the 1924 Fairfield commission. There's and so he goes to America along with some of the colonial government, and I brought up that he's the one who exposes the nationalistas. He exposes the fact that they strike this secret deal with the in Washington to delay independence, basically. Subsequently, after the fact, and by the way, the founder of the Communist Party is also in that delegation in 1924, which is also the same year that Wagenknecht goes over to the Philippines, the emissary from the Workers' Party of America, the pre-CPUSA formation, American formation. So there's a lot happening in that moment. Yeah, the Fairfield bill. They're supposedly going over to lobby American Congress for immediate independence, but Kaesung doesn't actually want it. The nationalists don't want it. So Recto comes out of this the Democratists, which is the opposition party, which was actually formed by a split-away labor group in opposition to the nationalistas, who saw the nationalistas as being too conciliatory to American imperialism. And he gets his kind of second wind in the post-war moment, and he mounts what's called what people refer to as a nationalist crusade I want to say it's like 55 or 56. So the people who really get politicized by this crusade are and he has staying power, like he's still politically active for years afterwards and maintains this campaign. Sisson and Sisson and Nemenzo, two of the cadre, the new left cadre who are recruited by the old left, by the PKP at UP Diliman as self-trained Marxist autodidacts, right? Maybe we can draw a parallel to C.J. Hunt and the autodidacts of the 1960s. They trained themselves. They got involved in this anti-colonial movement with people like Recto, and then they trained themselves in Marxism at the academe, and then the communists recruited them. So it's kind of an interesting trajectory. But they were first politicized around this question of national liberation rather than Marxism. Now, the funny thing is that Clara Recto's speechwriter was this guy who became the Secretary of Labor under Marcos. Now I'm blanking on his name, but he was adjacent to the Communist Party, the old left Communist Party. So, and Recto also defended members of the Communist Party when they were thrown in prison. So he was seen as a defender of the left, actually. So he did have these organic linkages to the left, but you could say that and some people would make the claim that the new left is basically kind of reducible to this post-war Rectoian postcolonial nationalism. So I think that's a fair argument to make, because despite the Maoist gloss, national democracy is just an argument from my perspective, it's kind of an argument for the Fordist state in the post-colony. And so, yeah. I would call it national Marxist nationalism rather than nationalist Marxism, because the Marxist component is just kind of a legitimation ideology, or the Marxists play some kind of junior partner in a united front or in a coalition that usually ends up not succeeding and failing. But yeah, so Recto is very important. He's like the father of, I guess, nationalism in this period. And he has students who become leaders some of his proteges become leaders as part of this coalition with the New Left in the 1986 moment. So they're like leading, like Jokno, I think, is his protege. Jokno is a civil rights lawyer who leads, one is the anti-Marcos leaders in the 1980s. Jokno and Salonga, I think both have connections to Recto. And also this guy, Constantino, who's maybe the most important ideologue of this kind of post-colonial nationalism. I don't know if that is helpful. Did you have a specific question about Recto, or?
Yeah, if you could answer it very quickly. You mentioned like there was like ironic way in which he was more internationalist or more cosmopolitan than like the new left that came after him. Like you had a kind of offhand remark.
Yeah.
Yeah.
I think so. Yeah. I mean, I read that little quotation for you. I mean, he doesn't kind of disavow the international context in the quote. He just wants Filipinos to have some of the pie, to operate in terms of some of the capital. He doesn't want all of it flowing out. So there were already ISI experiments happening, import substitution, industrialization going on in the 50s already. I think most of the 50s was like ISI, like his program was kind of already implemented as far as ISI goes, even though he was never politically successful. He wasn't he wasn't able to, politically, he wasn't able to become president. But I believe like there was still a kind of an international sentiment. They just wanted to be part of the international Fordist regime, and to be able to kind of plug into that and raise the standard of living in the country and industrialize it. I mean, but as far as the Maoists, when they come along, they're just obviously they're anti-imperialist to the hilt. And I guess this has to do with the kind of the antinomian dualistic character of the Cold War period where they just have to oppose American capitalism. And somebody like Brechto can be more honest about what he wants and more cosmopolitan in his aspirations. All right, so we should probably call it a day. Thanks, great discussion, guys. Appreciate it. Appreciate you hanging in there.